The Shadow That Took Me Away by Júlia Rosell Saldaña. Prologue. We live in a world where the food chain is marked by an eternal cycle. In our world, minerals are eaten by vegetables, these by herbivores, these by carnivores, and we eat the rest. We can add that fungi return everything to the earth in mineral form to the soil. That bacteria and other microscopic beings contribute, but that is for other stories and other scientific specialties. In any case, we believe we are the top point of a trophic pyramid from which we believe we have nothing above. And if this is not so, what if something above us is fed by emanations, energies, or more subtle things? Could it be that the fact of being sapient, conscious, and different from the rest of life forms as we understand it, made us fall prey to something that we cannot even understand? After thousands of years of civilization, after infinitely multiplying our numbers, we have done away with most of the predators that could turn us into their food. It is still common in certain parts of the world for our species to be just another dish on the menu of certain predators. It is still common, too, that we die from exogenous causes such as stings, diseases, bites, scratches, and others caused by other animals. But the concern for our survival is, today, something that we fully dedicate in our own society, and all problems that we experience regarding said survival occur in our day-to-day due to the complexities of an anthropocentric civilization that does not allow us to see beyond our noses. Introduction. My name is Pedro, and I am a fisherman by profession. I fish in the seas together with a very good crew on a boat in which we are 5 fishermen who have known each other since we were children. What I like most about being at sea is enjoying the starry nights without light pollution, where I can fantasize about impossible worlds and distant stars. The sight of the Milky Way every night makes me sleep like a baby, while I feel like something tiny in a huge universe in which I am much smaller, in comparison, than the atom of a grain of sand on the beach. I have never had a family because the time I spend on the seas makes it difficult for me to live with anyone other than my companions. We supply our village market with as many fish as possible, and it is a simple but hard way of life. My greatest companions are, when we coincide, dolphins that accompany us, and whom I feed to thank them for their company. Watching them play is something precious and magnificent. How wonderful it is to even bathe with them and swim in the sea. They are graceful, funny, and many times they take us where there are more fish so that we can cast the nets. The sea is the breeding ground of life, and there are so many huge animals that make us feel small. Whales and sharks, both of titanic size, which devour nothing but small fish in industrial quantities, make our boat look small. There are nights when even the sea is illuminated by some types of iridescent jellyfish that simply move with the currents of water and make the sea look like a light show that one can look at for hours. The sea and the boat are my life. I would not change my time for anything with the peace of being alone, although accompanied, in this great body of water that goes beyond the reach of sight. Life on the sea. Pedro was on the high seas with his companions, fishing as was customary in those fertile waters full of fish that gave them and their fellow citizens their bread. That day looked like one with no more problems than avoiding sunburn, because apart from the sea breeze, there weren't too many clouds on the horizon to protect the skin of those sailors from the ultraviolet light of the King Star. For those men, that hard work casting and retrieving nets was their life. No matter how much part of the work was automated, it was hard but honest and made them happy. They had lost count of how many generations before them had dedicated themselves to the same thing, performing absolutely the same tasks, with the technological differences of each era, of course. The boat they worked on was 3-story, well-equipped, and it was common for them to spend their free time together on the rest deck, where they communicated with other boats, played cards, or watched pre-recorded series or downloaded from the internet. At the rear could be seen the huge net, much larger than the boat, which was used to catch the schools of fish that hovered near the surface. Pedro, who was the most nervous of the group of fishermen on that boat, was the first to collect the captured fish, to put them in the boxes prepared for conservation until they reached the mainland. When they got a good booty and it was time to stop fishing, it was common to celebrate with a good meal, which Pedro's best friend, Miguel, was in charge of. That day, Miguel prepared a delicious pasta carbonara that must have been smelled for miles around. Diners were not only hungry, but also eager to try a taste more of land than sea. They toasted the good catch with a bottle of wine, while they smoked and played a game of cards. The rest that was well-deserved became a time of recreation that put the batteries back to those sailors hardened in 1,000 battles on the high seas. At the end of said recreation, they went back to look for more schools of fish to cast the net, but not before enjoying the sea breeze and the waves. The routine marked, as always, the comings and goings of that boat that was increasing in weight with each launch and retrieval of the net. Hours passed, and when the ship's hold was full of boxes full of fish, they returned to the port of their beloved town. The return trip passed quickly, and touching dry land seemed strange to them after so much time at sea. When they arrived, they helped them unload the boxes from the warehouse and received the corresponding payment. They changed, and each one went home with their families. When the time stopped, the days passed and the same routine was repeated over and over again. Our professional fishermen, well seasoned by experience, did not get tired of it, and it was normal for them to spend whole days on the high seas if necessary. The day everything changed, it seemed normal, but you could smell in the sea breeze that something was wrong. When they went out to fish, the fishermen were surprised by the calm sky and the lack of seagulls, but they did not give it too much importance. When they reached the high seas and started looking for fish, they were surprised that there was almost no animal movement in the waters, which at first they did not give too much importance to. The hours passed, or so it seemed, until they began to get nervous. Something in them told them that something strange was happening, something was wrong. Pedro, on the verge of a nervous breakdown, went out on the deck of the ship and saw that the sea did not move. He had a hard time realizing that the ship was still, as if the water was solid. He couldn't think of anything else but to throw an empty herring can into the water, which instead of sinking bounced back as if the water were land. A feeling of restlessness and anxiety ran through Pedro to the depths of his being, that he went to warn his companions of the abnormal situation. The companions went out on deck, half drunk, and confirmed that the sensation of movement they suffered was typical of drunkenness, and not the movement of the ship. The sea was still, there were no birds in the sky, and the horizon was clear and pristine. The fishermen and the boat were alone on the high seas, in a strange solitude and abnormal silence. They became more and more nervous, until they realized something that unnerved them even more. The sea breeze had disappeared. In that solitude, it occurred to them to try to contact other ships by radio, but they did not succeed because the radio's silence was such that there was not even static. The radio didn't work. When they checked, the clocks hadn't worked for a long time. Desperation began to invade them when they realized that they were at a standstill and without possible communication with the outside world. For them, that ship had become a prison frozen in time from which they could not escape. They were too many miles from the coast and the mainland to consider a walk through that solid sea that they did not know if it would later return to its liquid form. As they watched outside, Miguel sounded the alarm when he saw a strange shadow moving over the waters. It couldn't really be a shadow because it wasn't the projection of anything. There was no solid body that could project it through the light of the Star King, nor did it even have a recognizable shape. That solitary shadow or silhouette was changing shape as it slowly but inexorably approached the ship. That strange shadow increased in size until it made the ship look ridiculous, and for a few seconds the crew members were enveloped by a strange darkness. They felt as if they were falling next to the barrow and grabbed on as best they could while screaming in desperation. When it seemed that the world ended and that existence had disappeared from around them, they found themselves back on the high seas with total normality. The sea breeze, the waters, the birds, the fish, and the movement of the ship itself had returned to normal. The clocks and the radio were also working again. The crew had a small meeting where they discussed what happened and decided not to talk about it because it must have been the result of the amount of alcohol ingested. They spent the rest of the day working with their beloved net and filling the boxes with fish, while at times, perhaps due to stress or the fantastic situation they experienced, they seemed to see a strange shadow that moved out of the corner of their eyes they didn't care. The fishing town. They did not take long to arrive after that endless day. The group was quieter and less jocular than usual, but it did not take long for them to set foot on solid ground and regain their senses to carry out their routine tasks of unloading merchandise. Pedro, despite being forbidden to talk about the matter, it occurred to him to comment that he kept seeing a strange shadow, at times out of the corner of his eye, and that the last time he saw it, he seemed to be going towards the town. His companions reproached him for these comments and did not give more importance to his words. That picturesque coastal town had just over 1,000 souls and focused exclusively on everything related to fishing. The first settlements dated back more than 8,000 years, and despite all the changes that have occurred throughout history, somehow that fishing village remained an enclave, proud of its relationship with the sea. The town came alive at dawn when the fishermen went out to fish, and went out when the fishermen finished any recreational activity, often late at night. The epicenter of the town were the 2 bars, crowded all day, which ruled the town with more authority than any government institution. Since they had the day off the next day, Pedro and his companions went to spend the rest of the day at the bar, where they tried to somehow drown out the bad experience they had lived through the unpleasantness of the spirits. The first disappearances. The next day, the town woke up alarmed. According to several neighbours, their partners had disappeared during the night without leaving a trace. The last thing they remembered was going to sleep next to them and waking up alone in bed. After searching the house and surroundings, none of them located their partners, so they were alarmed. The news spread like wildfire, and soon the whole town was looking for the missing people everywhere. After several hours of searching, it was decided to call the authorities to formalize these disappearances and leave the task in the hands of the police justice, not without first fuss and concerns among the community. Apparently, and according to the police, the disappearances amounted to 8. The day passed between nerves, cars that came and went, policemen who asked questions and made fences in various areas of the town, while the town hall called for calm. At that time, nobody knew what had happened to the disappeared persons, since it was not common for anything of interest to happen in the town, except for disappearances at night. Despite the efforts of the police and the city council to try to keep the population calm, the power of the gossip, and especially of the groups that were in the bars, further heightened the spirits and the gossip that something bad was happening. In the village, although only a few hours had passed since the disappearances, that matter had transcended and had far exceeded the fishing mood of the town, which that day became a reflection of the mood. It went from being a fishing village in its entirety to being a village of the disappeared, or that was the impression it gave to any foreigner who passed by at that time. A bitter normality. The next day dawned like any other at the climatic level, but not at the town level. The air was rarefied by the attitudes of the villagers, who no longer had that pleasant and calm attitude, but gave off a restlessness and unease that was increasing as the hours passed. All the activities of the town resumed with a certain normality, but everything was carried out with suspicion and at the expense of constantly asking the authorities for explanations. The families of the disappeared were the most agitated, and they showed it as they continued to look for their relatives in the town. Pedro and his comrades, like any other day, went to the sea in search of the fish that provided sustenance for them, their families, and the town. They took with them that bitterness that was breathed in the town and were able to thank the sea that their routine as fishermen had given them a break. Miguel couldn't help but speak, as if it were a fantasy or an evil rumor, if he didn't have some relationship between what happened to them 2 days ago and the disappearances the next day. The companions were angry and preferred to ignore it. When they returned to the mainland with the day's catch, they unloaded their catch and went straight home without wanting to think about anything else. The first to notice the discomfort in their coffers were precisely the 2 bars in town, since the majority of faithful parishioners preferred to lock themselves up at home instead of being together with other goofy rumour-mongers in a closed place. That night in the town, no one slept normally. A journey from the dark. The next day the atmosphere was still warm in the town. A rarefied air haunted every street, and even the light of the Star King seemed dimmer than normal. Pedro immediately realized that something was wrong, because there were no seagulls or other birds in the sky. He had a déjà vu and felt the same chills that he did 3 days on the high seas. Something in his head was trying unsuccessfully to surface. When he dressed to go out to sea and opened the door, there was nothing but black darkness that enveloped everything. In that strange darkness, he could see in the background a silhouette even darker than the blackest night that was approaching him. He closed the door, thinking it was his imagination, and opened it again. He met a dark silhouette of a shape he couldn't define right in front of him, and he froze with fear. In a few seconds, a polar cold ran through his entire body, and he thought he was going blind because he did not see anything around him. He felt as if the sight was of no use to him. Settling the polar cold in his body, he felt himself falling, so he tried to look instinctively for a point of support to hold on to, but he couldn't find it. When he realized it, he was lying on a sandy ground. It was hot, and there was a dry and warm air blowing. He looked up and saw a landscape that was strange to him, full of strange plants that he had never seen in pale colours, and that twisted and moved to the sound of a rhythm that he could not understand. He tried to search for his house, the town and the sea, but he did not find them. He stood still, breathing that air, which somewhat relieved him after the polar cold he had felt, and he began to walk through that kind of wooded desert. The poor man was confused and disoriented. He was in an environment that he did not know, and from which he could only see glimpses of a landscape that reminded him of movies about Mars through that pale and pulsating vegetation. As he advanced, he was finally able to emerge from the vegetation, and in the background, he saw a jet-coloured monolithic structure rising just above a hill. A reddish light came out of the only visible opening of said structure, and moved by curiosity he approached. His legs felt like slabs, he was thirsty, and he felt like he was in some kind of alien world that smelled like a mixture of sulphur and musk. With each step he took, now that he was more aware of his situation, he realized that gravity was different, much heavier. His mind tried to make her think of something funny, and the idea came to him that if he was in a place with heavier gravity, then dieting wouldn't do him much good. He chuckled to himself and continued on his way up that hill to reach the structure. He didn't take long to arrive, but he had the feeling of having climbed a mountain. In front of him stood that structure. Inside, he could hear the noise of a water fountain, and when he looked, he saw that this reddish light was emitted by a huge eye embedded in a black sculpture of ominous shape that cast the shadow of a human silhouette. That lack of logic caused him confusion, but his thirst got the better of him, and he drank from the fountain in non-Euclidean ways until he calmed his craving for the liquid element. Once he felt relieved, he approached the sculpture, which in addition to light emitted a strange buzzing sound, and touched it. For a few seconds, thoughts foreign to his mind harassed him, and he saw as if a veil was torn. That veil seemed to separate different landscapes. Among them he could see his beloved home. He also felt warmth, as if somehow that sculpture welcomed him. While he was immersed in these thoughts and feelings, a grotesque being who was on all fours, not much taller than a 12-year-old boy and brown in colour, approached him. Pedro's first reaction was to back down, to which the being reacted by showing him the palms of his front paws as a sign of peace, trying to make him understand that he was not a threat. When Pedro calmed down, that being brought him a kind of green cheese, and with signs told him to eat it, which he did without further delay so as not to bother that being. At the first bite, he felt a mixture of pleasure and disgust because the taste of that kind of cheese was the strangest thing he had ever tasted. On one hand, it was delicious, but on the other, the texture and smell were horrible. He could not hide his reaction, and that being seemed, in his own way, to make fun of the situation. Seeing Pedro's reaction, he went to get another one of those cheeses and ate it without problems in front of him to show him that it was not bad at all. Pedro did not know how to communicate with that being, so he made a fuss and gestures as he could to try to ask him where he was, but that did not help, and the being made it clear that he did not understand what he wanted to tell him. When the sign show ended, the eye of that sculpture began to vibrate and emit the reddish light now in a rhythmic way. The grotesque being that offered him the cheese fled, scared, and Pedro did not know what to do. So it occurred to him to hide behind the ominous monolith. He looked towards the entrance of the structure and could see how that shadow that he saw in the sea was approaching him again. Slowly and inexorably, he could feel how that shadow was coming for him again. He came out from behind the sculpture screaming. He tried to flee, but that shadow caught him, and again he felt a polar cold and fell. When he realized it, he was on the floor of his house. Pedro got up and saw by the clock that it was already late, and he had been out for hours. If he had fainted, he was surprised that no one had come to his aid. The ghost town. Pedro left his house and found himself alone. Literally alone. There was no one in the streets, or in the houses, or in the cars, not even in the port. The whole town was empty of people, only the seagulls and the boats moved by the seawater in the port could be heard. Pedro was asking loudly if there was someone, but he did not receive an answer. He went around the house, shops, bars, nobody. It was as if the entire town had decided to leave without a trace. After hours of searching and realizing his loneliness, he called the police, who appeared with an ambulance due to suspicions of the delicate mental state of the interlocutor. Seeing the town empty, the police immediately understood that something was wrong and called for reinforcements. Meanwhile, despite the efforts of the ambulance paramedics to calm Pedro down, he was visibly upset and seemed delusional about strange shadowy worlds taking people away. It was decided to transfer Pedro to the nearest hospital and keep him under highly medicated observation due to his nervousness and discomfort. The following days were marked in the town by police investigations that focused on the search for the nearly 1,000 people who lived there. The press soon found out and ended up comparing the case with the lost colony of Roanoke in the United States. Miguel woke up, just like Pedro, in a totally different environment. He was covered in a fine layer of reddish dust, or so he thought, until he realized that everything around him was covered in the same. When he looked around, he could see that he was completely alone, surrounded by strange bluish vegetation. That reddish powder was not such, but a kind of snow. Miguel made an effort to get up and start walking, lost, looking for something to locate himself with, but his search was unsuccessful, and he not only did not know where he was, but he came to think that all that was a dream. Instinctively, he decided to get away from that strange vegetation, since sounds could be heard from the undergrowth that indicated the presence of something not very friendly. After more than 2 hours of wandering, he came across a kind of greenish lake with vegetation that seemed more friendly and recognizable around him. For him, that was an oasis, since when he checked it, that green water was drinkable and quenched his thirst. Miguel was alone, surrounded by reddish snow and bluish plants, in a place with a green sky with red clouds. When he finished drinking, he looked at the sky and sat down by the lake, where he began to cry, thinking that he would never return to his beloved home or see his beloved sea again. The hospital. Pedro was tied to a hospital bed, stuffed full of sedatives due to his constant attempts to escape. He just wanted to go home and look for his friends and acquaintances. They were his life, as was the sea. He had lost count of how many times he had tried to free himself, And even so, he tried again until a nurse came asking him to calm down, and failing to make him see reason, he injected some strange concoction that made him calm down by force. He tried to explain to that friendly nurse about the shadow that took him to an alien world, where all the inhabitants of his town would surely be. The poor nurse tried to empathize with Pedro, but for him what he was saying were the delusions of a madman who must have lost his sanity due to the shock and trauma of losing everyone he knew. The nurse had read in the press about the disappearance in the coastal town, and he was aware that a situation like this would drive anyone crazy. He tried by all means to support Pedro emotionally, until he fell asleep due to the effect of the injection. The next day, Pedro woke up still tied. A couple of guards came to see him and brought him breakfast, told him that he had a visitor, and if he was willing to receive her. Pedro accepted, seeing that he didn't have anything better to do either. After a while, a very tall, stocky woman with curly, ashy hair came in, dressed in a black blazer that fit her just right, a black ankle-length skirt, and immaculate black ankle boots. The woman took a seat next to Pedro and asked how she was feeling, to which the man shrewdly and mockingly replied that he was tied up but decently well. That visit she pretended to laugh and told him that what had happened to her was obviously abnormal, but that she had an explanation. Pedro's curiosity made him ask that woman what he knew about the matter with great interest. The woman told him that what she had found must be an interdimensional being that fed precisely on the string left by the dimensional journeys of its victims. As she told him, each dimension has a particular existential mark or imprint at the atomic and subatomic level, and since energy is neither created nor destroyed, when there is an interdimensional journey, there is an exchange. In this exchange, all of the traveller's particles are exchanged with particles from the destination dimension, which leave a trace in a dimension between dimensions where beings like the one found live, and it is this trace that they feed on. These beings are not idiots, so they make sure that when they take their victims to other dimensions, they survive long enough to feed them for a reasonable time. Pedro, surprised, asked her how she knew so much and how she had found it, to which the woman replied that being a dimensional traveller, she herself noticed when there were other travellers nearby, so she decided to come and explain what had happened to make him understand that he was mad. When she asked why she had sent him home, the woman shrugged her shoulders and said she didn't know, that maybe the food wasn't good enough or disgusting for the creature's liking, then laughed. Pedro at first, and due to the situation, took it badly, but when he reconsidered, he realised that the matter was funny to him, and he also laughed. The woman then asked him if she could do something for him, to which Pedro replied that she would at least want to find his friends. The visitor's expression changed and she told him that there were infinite dimensions, so finding them was an impossible task. In any case, he could try going to town to find a trail, although he would need his help to find out which trails would lead to his friends and which would not. Pedro, who was still tied to the bed, told him that he didn't care how or when, that what he wanted was to get out of that hospital and look for his friends at all costs. The woman smiled and took his hand. The last thing Pedro saw was a light that blinded him. When the guards entered the room, they found it empty. Both the visitor and the patient had disappeared without a trace. By protocol, they began a search of the hospital and its surroundings. They notified the authorities, but they never found the missing patient from the room. Between dimensions. In a place that was not a place, strange beings lived, somehow similar to apes mixed with dogs and with greyish skin, bipedal and horrendous, who wandered with no other desire than to eat. The last search in our dimension had left almost 1,000 dimensional traces to feed on, so an unknown number of those beings gathered near them to devour the subtle energies of the exchange. Those almost 1,000 souls were now scattered through hundreds of unknown dimensions in which they had to survive as best they could, without knowing where they were or how they would get back to their home. That did not matter to the beings that inhabited that dimension, because in their understanding, They had only obtained their food through numerous and stupid prey. That dark space of colours that the human eye is unable to perceive or describe was inhabited not only by those beings, but by horrors far beyond what the imagination can develop and what the mind is capable of withstanding. The insignificance of human existence, comfortable in its almost hives of concrete, asphalt and steel, meant nothing in the immensity of the universe, even more so of the multiverse. As time passed and the trail of victims faded, those dimensional denizens would become hungry again and set out, once again, in search of victims in our world, as well as in worlds that we cannot even dream of. Like atoms of grains of sand on the beach, we are nothing more than an insignificant thing in an existence that expands in physical dimensions that we cannot comprehend. The press and the new attraction. For days, both the press and the media echoed what happened in the coastal town. The disappearance of almost 1,000 people was difficult to go unnoticed. Hundreds of families looking for their relatives constantly took over the television channels, which made a killing with the matter at the cost of the suffering of those people. The bureaucracy in those days suffered from an exhausting work for inheritances and real estate matters, while the government tried to calm things down by promising help for families. The nearby towns lived for a time in fear of the same thing happening to them, but luckily and over time, they began to forget the situation when they saw that the same fate did not come to them. As the weeks passed, that ghost town became an attraction due to the state of things, since they had been abandoned and were in perfect condition. Groups of people passionate about the strange visited the town fascinated by its state, while programs of dubious quality that were broadcast at dawn sent reporters and then broadcast reports where they spoke of suspected aliens or government conspiracies. There were parapsychologists and mediums who also approached the town, some out of interest and curiosity, and others for profit. As it tended to happen, over time the matter was forgotten, and the families and friends of the disappeared were abandoned once again, struggling to find an explanation for what happened in that once bustling town, the journey to the unknown. Pedro and the mysterious woman went incognito to the town, where they were looking for the last places where Pedro's friends were. The once bustling town was now swarming with tourists, for-profit smoke sellers, and policemen trying to do their jobs. Pedro and his companion went to the places where their missing friends could have been, and in each location they disappeared to appear in strange dimensions looking for the trace. They came and went from one dimension to another, where they could spend hours searching, even knowing that there was little chance of finding them. Pedro was grateful to this strange woman for her time, and although he knew that she might never find her friends, she never gave up hope. As the days, weeks and months passed, Pedro met other alien worlds and strange civilizations. With the passage of time, he was losing that emotional attachment to his own world, and understood that thinking of a fixed place no longer made sense. He was late, but little by little he became a dimensional traveller in which he was the companion of the woman who took him out of the hospital. Although he never found his friends, he became a dimensional sailor, as he had been a saltwater sailor before.